Jackson County recently held a workshop on the integration of non-lethal predation tools and methods into county wolf management strategies. For those of you who couldn't make it, here's an overview, or watch the entire workshop at jacksoncounty.org.
The purpose of this workshop, it's an educational workshop, and that's what, and we're focused on what the role of non-lethal methods in predation management with a focus on wolves. Now, I know as soon as I mention wolves, that there's a lot of opinions, a lot of strong feelings either way about wolves, and I just want to direct people to say that we're not here to discuss whether wolves belong on the landscape. This is a workshop on dealing with the realities of wolves on the landscape, because that decision of whether wolves are going to be on the landscape, that's already been made by the state of Oregon, and it's already played out and continues to play out as far as how they should be managed and what have you. But non-lethal is certainly a component of the state's plan to manage wolves, and that's what we're going to focus on today.
I know this is a non-lethal tools workshop, but I did put both non-lethal and lethal tools in the title. I'm not going to go into detail about the lethal tools available because many people are already familiar with those, and if you're not, I can talk to you about them at break. But I just wanted to mention, as John mentioned, that sometimes non-lethal tools don't work, and so you need to have that as a back pocket option. And so I wanted to at least put that on the table so that you understand that I believe that the toolbox has to be full of every option. And I'm going to show some science-based evidence behind that idea. So this is what we often think of. I'm kind of going to extend this analogy. We talk about them as non-lethal tools, and so I'm going to talk about the entire toolbox and even the tool shed that they all belong in. And we often think that you're going to walk in and that there's all these data and the science out here, and you have this nice organized, you can just go in and reach for exactly the tool you need. But as most of us know, this is probably what our toolboxes and our tool sheds look like, at least if you come to my house. You kind of have this rusty old toolbox with just your trusty 5 to 10 tools that you always go to, sitting in something that's a little bit dilapidated. Maybe you're a little fearful to keep the door shut when you walk in. And this does look like my backyard. But what we're trying to do with science is get from this to something a little bit more organized. You don't need 5,000 different things. You need to know, though, when you walk in, what's useful, which tool to grab, and how it'll work. And that's what I'm hoping to provide a little bit of background on a few of those today to get to this point. Okay, so I'm going to talk from a science-based approach. I'm going to try, in fact, I don't have much data or statistics in here on purpose, so trust me, I'm a scientist. But what I wanted you to know, though, is the background is that we do use a science-based approach. So a lot of the research we do you may see as kind of like, well, why are you doing that when what you're really trying to do? What I want to know is how to not have my cattle or sheep get killed. Well, a lot of times what we need to know is what's going on in the background with the predators. And so we do everything from interactions, whether that's with people, livestock, or prey, or native prey. We also look at things like behavior and physiology of the animals, and that helps a lot with designing tools too. Or even things like, more laboratory, like physiology and genetics. But as you can see from this rough Venn diagram I've placed up, there is an area of overlap. And that's usually when you combine all of that background information, you get the foundation to make scientific-based approaches to developing tools and technology to reduce livestock conflict or any other types of conflict with predators. Okay, so again, I'm going to talk about the scientific-based approach to get to that clean toolbox and provide you with some ideas of things that are out there already that can be used. But I don't want us to think of ourselves as becoming the tools. And sometimes there's some non-lethal tools out there that aren't necessarily always based on the science. So I'm just going to talk about the ones that are. Okay, there's a lot of them. This is just a list of some that I came up with in about 10 minutes of brainstorming. We're not going to talk about all of them. I will talk about them, though, in a way that they fall into one of 3 categories. The first category I think about are ones that focus on changing predator behavior, okay? And we're going to talk about a few. Flattery was a great example of that. The next is things that change predator biology. So this is where some of that genetic and physiological information comes in handy. And the last one is things that focus on changing human behavior, okay? Some of these tools may fall under multiple categories, but that's how I kind of organize the tools in the toolbox. And these ones highlighted in yellow are just a few of the ones that fall under those categories, and I'm going to talk about in a little bit more detail, so don't worry about it yet. Okay, so first, things that change predator behavior. What are we talking about? Well, first and foremost is Flattery. Now, there's two types of Flattery we think of. One is displayed here, and that's what we call electrified or turbo Flattery. And then the second one is where you don't electrify it. The big differences are costs, in that obviously electrifying something has more tools with it, and so it costs more, but it also can increase the time until the animals habituate to it. So there's that benefit to it. There are a couple of problems with Flattery, one that we have overcome and one that we are currently doing research on to overcome. The first one is that flags coil. So I'm going to step out here. Since we have this nice, I think Zach brought this, is that right? Thank you. Okay, so what happens is when these flags are flapping in the wind and being very scary to canids is they can coil in the wind, okay? Well, that creates this nice gap that a wolf or coyote that's been testing this can now just duck under. The second problem, while I have this out, is that this is pretty wide distance between flags, which we've noticed from all of our behavioral observations of coyotes. The coyotes test and finally go between the two flags. So we think this might be a little bit too wide. I know we're talking about wolves today, but coyotes are still the #1 predator in the United States against sheep, at least. And so this might be an issue of that we might just need to make them closer together. And that's what we're doing research on this winter, to see if this versus this changes the length of time until coyotes will break that boundary and make Flattery more effective against both. We don't think it would change how it works against wolves. So, but #1 we've resolved. And the way we resolved this is testing a bunch of different designs. I worked with 2 seamstresses. They thought it was the weirdest project to have to, sew things for, but they did a great job. So we had 6 new designs versus this original design. And we tested it in 2 different thicknesses of material. Similar to this one, the thick vinyl, and then the one that's traditionally used, which is this thin nylon. And you can even see here how it sort of starts to fray. So in the wind, especially in communities with a lot of sagebrush or other plants that can really grab onto it, you get more fraying. And basically what we found is that 2 designs coil less. One is what we call the shower curtain design, so think of it as 2 rings. We just used rope. That's this one here, where it hung from, and so that way when it spun, it kind of didn't coil, it just kept spinning. And then the other one was we just tied a knot in them all. And that also, so those 2 designs, we did what's called a survival analysis, so we considered the flag dead when it coiled. There's a paper over there if you want to read the details. Those 2 survived greater than 99% of the length of the study. Some of these other designs were more like 30% survival, so they died pretty quickly, creating gaps. So #2, as I mentioned though, is that coyotes, and this is a coyote grabbing some food, some very appealing food we placed on just the other side of the Flattery. We did test both these new designs with coyotes, and they both are just as effective as the original design. We were a little worried maybe the knot didn't make it flap and is scary, but that doesn't seem to be a problem. But what we're finding is that those coyotes will continue to test until they can reach between the flags without being scared of it anymore. And so that's what we're going to work on this winter, is decreasing that width and seeing if that also increases the length of time before animals will habituate and Flattery no longer becomes effective. Okay, the second one John also mentioned, which was nice, which is a sound and light repellent. These can be something as small as this. This is just barely larger than your cell phone, or things like the Fox lights, which are a little bit bigger. Some of them are really big and have multiple parts. This is kind of a homemade version of some of the things that are for sale commercially. But what we have is 2 types. One is a radio-activated guarding system, which works really well in areas where maybe there's already collared wolves, and so you can listen for them. Well, you don't have to, but manually have a device listening for them, and it only goes off when those animals are in the area, which increases the time to habituation because it's very specific to those animals. Or you can have a motion-activated one or a random one now too. So motion-activated may just be when it detects some sort of motion in the area, but that could also go off for other animals too. And so it decreases the time to habituation. This is just another example of one, and this one's one of those small pelican briefcase types, so just to show you differences in sizes. But here's just an example from a research study that was done several years ago. I'm pretty sure Stuart was involved in this one. But you can see this is just a control, so having nothing going on. This is a stimulus which is at random times, so similar to a Foxlight or other commercially available devices. And this one's behavioral contingent, so that's when it's related to a collar and an animal actually triggering a device. And you can see it takes a lot more time, either more time or also just fewer animals will habituate to that when it's behavioral contingent. So when it's only responding to an animal in the area. But it's still effective even if it's at random. Aversive conditioning can also happen in other ways, and I'm just going to mention two. One is electric fencing. I saw there's a lot of material here, and I just wanted to bring it up here. It's not so great for canids. It can work a little bit, but more in combination with something like Flattery. But it's really effective for bears, especially black bears. That's why I thought it was worth mentioning here. And there's a lot of information on how to design your electric fencing to protect whatever livestock you're protecting.
I have a question.
Yes.
On the random lights, I've got several of those. I've got 3 of those out at my place. And what I was wondering, if they become habitualized to the light, if the light is moved to another location, does the whole process start over again, or are they already, used to the strobe or not? Or do you know that? Have research been done there?
So we haven't done that specifically yet. I could hypothesize a little based on what I know of canid behavior from other studies. And yeah, moving them before an animal has a chance to habituate is probably your best bet. So moving them more frequently will increase the time to habituation because that adds another random element, right? So once they've habituated, it kind of can depend. We've had animals with our strobe lights, for instance, with captive coyotes, that once they break the barrier and go after the food, they learned it's not harmful, and they will just ignore it from there on out. Now, we didn't move it, though, in that case.
Yeah.
So, but I think it depends. If they were able to make a kill, for instance, then they might ignore it then on out because the reward was so great, right? But maybe if they just habituated but didn't get a reward for it, moving it might at least work for a little bit. But I would assume, based on what we know of canid behavior, that it wouldn't last for as long again. So that is one reason, a lot of these tools we suggest like using during critical periods. So, for sheep that might be lambing, for calves that might be calving, when your livestock are most sensitive to depredation, and then removing when that threat's gone. In some of those cases, that might be why, what John's doing with letting ranchers know when wolves are in the area is so helpful. Because you can just use it for a short period of time, remove it before the animal habituates, so you can use it again the next year.
I just never know when they're going to be there, and so I've moved them a couple of times, but prior to moving them, after I moved them also, I saw 2 or 3 different times what I believed was a wolf, but they act like they're kind of avoiding the lights, but still coming into the area. Anyhow,
and canids, that's great. That's a great point, because canids, that's what I'm talking about, like with the coiling flags. Canids will continually test things. And so you guys have probably all seen that video out of Oregon or was it Washington, the wolf walking the Flattery line? There's a YouTube video you can watch. And so they're going to continuously test things. And so the more you can make it work by either moving it or making sure the flags are uncoiled or whatever the device is, and that's where a lot of times human behavior comes into effect and having that human presence, the longer it's going to take them to habituate to it. Because they're going to always, they live there. And so they're going to always encounter it, and they're going to test it if there's something appealing on the other side of it. So one of the things that has started to work, and I don't know if you guys are still even working on this was more in the Midwest population, but aversive conditioning as far as the GPS collars put on wolves actually had a shock collar element to them. Now, initial research, there was some some actual physiological negative effects to the wolves, so they stopped. But they restarted some tests, and these two more recent papers show that it is effective with the new systems that they've put in. It's obviously pretty financially expensive, and that requires the state or the federal agency to get involved. So this isn't necessarily a tool that you as a producer can use, but it might be something you can talk to state and federal agencies in the area about, whether it's worthwhile in Oregon. Yes?
How does that shock collar, does it require a cow to have a collar, and so it senses when the wolf is so close? When does it shock? Or does someone have to sit there and watch
sorry. No, you don't have to sit and watch. There's a lot of GPS collars now where you can make these virtual fences. And so in this case, in the Midwest, it's almost all private land operations. And so they could outline the fences of calving or land. I think in this case, it was all calving grounds. And so if the wolf tried to cross that, it shocked them. So it takes a little bit of GIS wizardry, but it's completely within the logistical framework of our capacity as people. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on guard animals, and what guard animals really work on is they do change predator behavior, and that they kind of create this deterrent. There's a lot of different types of guard animals out there. And one of the things I like to start with is this question that I found, are they right for me? So this is a great way to think of it. There's kind of 5 questions. What type of predators? In this case, we're really focused on wolves, so we're going to skip over that. What type of livestock are you protecting? How many animals are needed? So if you're in an area with very large packs of wolves, you would want more guard, like maybe more dogs if you were using dogs, than just a single dog isn't going to do very well against a pack of 12 wolves. What type of system will they work in? So are you on small fenced ones? There was somebody, I think, that just recently might have to get rid of their dogs because they bark too much and the neighbors were suing. So if you're in small areas, you might want to look at breeds that are less vocal, or different types of guard animals that aren't vocal at all like that. And then the 5th one is, do you have the time and energy and capacity to feed them separately, or are they something that needs to just eat whatever the livestock are eating? So livestock protection dogs are one of the ones that are most effective in areas where there are wolves. They are this ancient traditional way. They've been used for thousands of years in Europe, and they both reduce damage and are liked by people on both sides because they do allow for coexistence. They really gained popularity in the late 70s, early 80s in the United States. In that time, it was just to protect against coyotes. And so they're most commonly used with sheep, but especially in other parts of the world, they're used with all types of livestock. And they work really well with all types of livestock if they're properly bonded to those livestock. So again, the resurgence really came about in the United States because we started banning more predicides, we started wanting more non-lethal tools, and a lot of the techniques were just not adequate. There are a lot of pros to using guard dogs. Here's just a list of a few ones. Again, they can work with a variety of livestock. They can analyze the threat, so it takes longer for the predators to habituate, because if they're properly bonded and properly trained, they're not barking at every deer and squirrel out there. They're only barking at the predators. They bond to the livestock, so they're actually with them pretty much at all times. They can also, because they do bark when there's a threat, or most of them do, they alert the producer or herdsman to the potential threat, so then there can be that human presence, and they do provide a form of long-term protection. They usually, survive 10 to 12, well, even longer than 12 years, but most people think they really get good at about 2 years of age, and some people, a lot of producers say they start to slow down by the time they're about 12. So one of the nice things is that they're actually cost effective. They have a large upfront cost, but relative to some other methods that are available, their cost, livestock protection dogs are here, for those of you that can't see in the back. So relatively, even though it feels like a large upfront cost, it's relatively low, and especially when you put that in terms of their effectiveness. So here you have cost to implement again, is this background blue bar, and then whether or not ranchers thought they were very effective in yellow, somewhat effective in this pinkish red, or not effective in green. And so relative to other methods, their cost per perceived effectiveness is a pretty good ratio to the advantage of the producers. There are some cons. If they're not properly bonded, trained, or whatever, they may kill or harass the livestock. They may kill or harass wildlife, so if you're in an area with endangered species, you have to make sure they're properly trained not to go after other things. They may wander. In all of our studies, we spay or neuter, and that really reduces that wandering behavior. You have to train them not to be aggressive to people, because they could be aggressive to people. And they may not tolerate, you have to train them to be introduced to herding dogs and other things like that so that they understand which ones are specific predator threats in the canid world and which ones aren't. And so they need time, they need guidance, they need training. But there are a lot of resources out there. We'll just skip over that. There's a lot of resources out there. I think a few of them are here. A lot of them are online. There's a book. You can read all about them if you haven't used them. I find a lot of times, especially at meetings like the American Sheep Industry meeting, there's so many people that have used them now for decades that there's this huge resource within the community that might not be available by looking up at books or online, but just by talking to your neighbor ranchers. And there's also signs that help with some of the liability issues. So there's ones in green that are for private property and ones in blue if you're grazing on public property. And this helps inform people in the area of what's going on. You can put contact information, you can put dates that the dogs are out there. You can talk to your neighbors about it to kind of help reduce liability issues associated with dogs. For those of you that are on maybe smaller or private properties and don't want that barking, there are things like llamas. They have some pros in that they're highly sociable, they're aggressive to canines, and they're tall. So if you're in an area with lots of high vegetation, they might be able to see things that maybe dogs or other smaller guard animals can't. But they don't bond necessarily with the livestock, so they provide an indirect. They just don't like canines. If you've ever seen a llama around them, they'll do that little stomping and spitting and alarm calling. But, we have heard of cases where people put a couple llamas together and the llamas just hang out on one side of the pasture and the sheep in the other. So that's because of this indirect thing. Again, here's a long list of pros, and they do tend to work for 20 to 25 years, which is amazing. And they are compatible if you are in an area where there's lethal tools, right? They're not going to pull an M44. And so that's sometimes an advantage for people, especially in smaller pastures. Now, one of the cons is, they don't like canines, so they don't really work well if you have guard dogs. And they might not do well in areas where you have, again, large packs of wolves, because they don't do well when there's multiple animals at one time making the threat. So, and sometimes llamas get killed by wolves. So, okay, donkeys are another example of a guard animal. And again, these are all pictures with sheep, but they can work with other species as well of livestock. Again, they're highly territorial. They just really dislike canines, and they're very alert. But again, it's this indirect type of protection in that they don't necessarily bond with the sheep, although I'm sure somebody in here, when I say these things, these are general trends. I usually have somebody go, I have a donkey, and it's it's best friends, like, this picture here with the goat, so it can happen. But in general, that's not how they work. There are also a lot of other guard animals out there, so I just mentioned those three because those seem to be the three most popular for all sorts of livestock. But we've seen all sorts of different things, and so I'm going to just briefly mention that beyond donkeys, llamas, and dogs, there are some other options out there. There are people using yaks. There are people, I saw someone using ponies. So there's all sorts of things as long as you can bond them. One of the other things that people like to use as far as livestock is protecting within other livestock. So mixed herds, if you're somebody that has cattle and sheep or goats or whatever, sometimes mixing those herds help. We work with a producer up in Montana that, for instance, mixes herds during part of the year, and then when they're not mixed, the area where they have seen the most predators, they put their, what they consider their more aggressive livestock. So they're male cattle, or sometimes they're rams, where they kind of protect themselves to a bit. And then, of course, something John's already mentioned is other guard animals, which a lot of times can be people. Having a human presence can really help. It's just like all these tools, though it's not 100% foolproof. But we often think of other people as something that happens in other societies and not in our own U.S. culture. But and so these are just pictures from around the globe of herdsmen or herdswomen working with their livestock. But we see this all the time here, and these are pictures right here from the United States of, our ranchers and herdsmen out with their livestock, and so it's not, it just helps. And then, of course, another category is the predator biology. And so the one I'm going to talk about briefly is sterilization. And so what we have found is that sterilization can significantly reduce livestock depredation. It's the same concept as denning, which happens more frequently in coyotes than wolves, but where you would go in, but this would be non-lethal instead of lethal. Because basically the concept is if you have a canid pair, whether that's wolves or coyotes, without pups to feed, they're more likely to feed on other things than livestock. In coyotes, it's that they tend to just eat the rabbits and rodents. They won't go after as large a prey. And so we have studied this where we've gone out and sterilized coyotes in the wild. And in one case, it was in an area of a pronghorn calving grounds. And in another area, it was overlap with sheep. And in both cases, depredation was significantly reduced in the coyote pairs that no longer had pups. In wolves, there was a study done in Alaska, and in that case, they showed that the pair actually lived longer. So it's kind of like your dinks for, for us as humans, your double income, no kid families. You kind of have an easy life, right? so they don't have as much, I guess, costs because they're not always raising young, and so they will live longer. And why this is important is because these animals, canids, wolves especially, and coyotes, are territorial. And so if you have a pair that can maintain that territory for longer, that's not killing livestock, then they're keeping out other animals that might be livestock killers. Okay, the problem though that we have right now with this as far as a large scale technique is that our sterilization has all been surgical so far for field studies. And that's pretty costly and takes a lot of handling. And so what we're working on now is ways to see whether or not chemical sterilization will work. So this is just birth control for canids. And we have tested a couple of chemical sterilants that are really effective in dogs and also have been effective in coyotes, at least when males were just alone and not paired with females. And then we measured a bunch of things, such as their hormones and behavior, and we found that behavior was similar. We were really excited because we thought, with chemical sterilization, you're actually altering hormones. And so we thought that might affect pair bonds or territorial behavior, and we didn't find those things, which are important to keep them on protecting that part of the landscape where there might be livestock. So we were really excited until we found out they all had puppies anyway. And it was really crazy because, I went one too. We actually had 18 pairs of coyotes on the study, and 15 of them had puppies. So, coyotes, what do they say? Coyotes and cockroaches when the world ends, right? So, we're still working on that now. We've kind of gone back to the drawing board on developing new chemical sterilants. We don't think that some of these problems would happen with wolves because wolves are more similar to dogs, since that's the wild ancestor to the dog. But if we can develop something that works for coyotes, it should also still work for dogs or wolves or whatever else. So we're still developing that. Then a few other things that have been based on predator behavior. One is scent marking barriers. And I get this a lot. Sometimes I get this asked of people, like, well, with human presence, can I just go around and kind of pee at the four corners? We didn't try it with humans, but we did try it or other people also have tried it with the urine from the same predator, right? Again, they're territorial. So what happens if you put scent of other wolves around an area? Will it keep wolves out? And it has been effective in the wild in wolves in a study in Idaho. It did not work for coyotes. Coyotes actually were more attracted to those areas and kept visiting it and marking over it. So there's some possibility there, but again, they'd probably habituate because there's no wolf to back up that scent. So it might work for a short time, but not for a long time. And then the other thing that's been tried is supplemental feeding. And actually here in Oregon, supplemental feeding has worked in black bears to reduce damage to forestry. But it has not worked when it's applied more towards livestock or other types of territorial behavior of canids and grizzly bears and things. And that's also probably, I bring the supplemental feeding up because I think it goes back to the idea of removing carcasses. And so some people think, well, maybe if I just move it all over here, then the predators will just go over here. And that's not going to work. So that gets into human behavior, which is kind of all linked again. And there's a lot of different things. Yes?
I've got another question.
Yes.
Right along that line. The place I live is where over 7, came to Southern Oregon. And when that wolf first showed up, there were bone piles. Most ranchers in the past have had bone piles in our carcass disposal area. And my question is, are you convinced, and I've asked John the same thing, so I've got you kind of trapped. If I were to remove every bone on my place, are you convinced those wolves wouldn't still come back and investigate and be curious? And I'm not. So
Okay.
slap me around and clue me in.
Okay, am I convinced that if you remove all the carcass parts, would the wolves not come around anymore? No, because they're territorial. Now, would they be attracted and want to come around to that spot? No, because you've removed a resource that kept drawing them in.
Territory is still theirs.
But it seems to depend on wolves, because it looks like, at least down here, these aren't really that established. And so there's still opportunities to move them on the landscape, because they're going to...
How many years before you would say established? I mean, these guys have been calling this home for, what, John, 4 years now?
Yeah, since 2014.
I mean, the thing is so you saw John's map. They're big territories. And so for them to visit specific sites isn't going to happen daily, right? If they were really covering that entire territory, they're probably not visiting. And so if you can remove things that attract them near this tempting animal that's walking by, then do it, because it's going to help. It doesn't mean they're never going to come by if that's still in their territory, but it's going to reduce the frequency. The idea is that it reduces the frequency at which they come by, which reduces your risk, I think.
You heard it from the expert, Ted.
I keep looking at John to see if he's giving me a thumbs up or thumbs down.
Ted and I have been discussing this at length.
But that is that's why I talk about limitations here, which is cost, knowledge, and time. So that was a knowledge question. So hopefully we gave you the knowledge to make an informed decision. But there's costs and time associated with removing everything. And in this case, I think it's worth it. In other cases, maybe the risk, because there's one wolf out there on, a 200 square kilometer area, and so your risk is so low that maybe you're not ready to put out Flattery, for the costs. But if you're in an area where there's known depredations already happening and there's a pack of wolves, then it's probably worth the cost. So that's what, that's like I might say, well, what is the goal? Is your goal 0 depredations, never ever? Then you probably, I don't know, get out, But if your goal is to just reduce your risk and make sure that you're staying, in the green or red or what is it? That you're making a profit and not having to shut down your operation, then you balance out the cost, knowledge, and time and figure out what you're comfortable with as far as a risk assessment. Yeah. And so, along those lines, it's like we plan this, is compost training. So one of the things you can do is remove carcasses. I don't know, does Oregon have any composting groups yet? So Montana has a really good composting program. This was actually Ohio State had composting training a couple days before we did a workshop there. I was at one of these non-lethal tools workshops in South Dakota, and they have composting there. And a lot of people think, well, maybe the climate's too harsh, or what happens if a cow dies in January and the ground's frozen? They still have ways of composting. So if you don't have a place to remove and bury, another way is compost, and then a lot of times that can then be used back on the landscape, and especially if you run a part of your property as a farm. And so there are a lot of, I don't know if Oregon specific has these type of workshops. No, not yet. Maybe they will in the future, in the soon future. But there are workshops, there's online information, and so I think there's enough information out there. I don't know if there's any out today, but if not and you want it, come find me and I'll email you a couple links to some of this information. But if you don't like the idea of just burying and waiting, you can also compost and speed up that process.
You hear me okay? My name's Glenn Archambault, and I'm here in Jackson County. And I want to go back to a moment about the bone piles and guard dogs and that discussion. What has your experience been with this? And this has been my experience, is having guard dogs, and there's coyotes have killed a ewe, and those dogs will be right on it at light. They're right sitting with it. And so through the day and night, what I learned is that if I moved that carcass, that the guard dogs now have lost their kill, because the guard dogs took the kill from the coyotes sometime. At some point, the coyotes had to leave because the guard dogs were on them. It's now their kill. So if you moved it, what I found is the coyotes just immediately killed another sheep. But they always came back and checked. That's the first thing they did. If you sat quietly, is they'd come into the field and check that kill. But if the guard dogs were on it, they moved them off. So on a much larger scale, what's been the experience with that issue?
Right. Gosh, I haven't had that. So we just finished up a 4-year guard dog study across the Rocky Mountains, across 5 states, including Oregon. We were up near the Mount Emily Pack in the surrounding area for Oregon. But we were mainly focused on wolves and grizzly bears. The coyote, I haven't heard of that as far as the dogs moving off and then allowing the coyotes to come back in.
They would let them back in if there were enough coyotes to start moving sheep.
Yeah.
Yeah, then they'd have the pressure, and the dogs would give up the kill. But during the daytime, as long as there wasn't a lot of pressure from coyotes, they would sit on that kill waiting for the coyotes to come back.
Oh, that's interesting. And that might just be specific behavior that your dogs have learned because it's been effective. Because if they wait there, the coyotes come back.
Yes,
So
they knew that.
My suggestion for other people is to not let your dogs be trained on that, right? Like remove the carcass immediately before the dogs have learned, because it sounds like your dogs have learned, if I sit here and wait, the coyote's going to come back in and I can continue my job as pursuer and, guard. So I don't know if there's anything you can do until you get new dogs, other than work with them to train them, but that would probably be very specific.
But what we found is that if you move the kill, then you just guaranteed another kill.
Yeah, that's interesting. I haven't seen that elsewhere. So that's what I mean is I think somehow your dogs have associated guarding the kill with protecting from coyotes instead of just guarding, at least in these situations. So that's really specific. We did find interesting, in fact, we just finished the analysis last week, that we did what's called an occupancy model. So it's presence and absence of animals in areas. And we looked at it, the sheep, this was mostly on public properties where the sheep move throughout the season, the grazing season. And we actually found that when there are what we call a grazing unit, so that's sheep, dogs, and humans in this case, because they're all together at all times, that we found a 75% higher probability that coyotes will be there. Whereas before the sheep were there or after the sheep were there, the coyotes weren't necessarily caught by our cameras. Wolves were the exact opposite. They were 75% less likely to be there. So we think what's happening is the sheep are attracting the coyotes that are already probably there territorially. They're in that area and they're being attracted. In our case, though, we didn't have any coyote depredation during those summers. So in that case, the dogs must have been actually doing their job of protecting the sheep. Whereas we think with the wolves, the sheep unit is displacing them temporarily. That's how the guard dogs are working. So I think it's just the guard dogs, it might just be a case of, again, your guard dogs have somehow learned this behavior, or also you could just have perhaps not enough dogs per coyotes in your area. Because what coyotes will learn to do is kind of like distract dogs over here while some of their other pack comes in a different ways. And so sometimes it's either having more dogs or just having dogs that behave differently. So some dogs, if you guys that work with guard dogs probably know this already, some dogs will there's a predator in the area, I need to pursue it. Some will be like, there's a predator in the area, I need to sit here in the middle of sheep and make sure they're protected. And having a combination of those behaviors is going to increase your protection, and it might be that all your dogs are now behaving a certain way. So.
I will tell you this, though, having the dogs behave like that was very effective.
Yeah,
it worked very well.
Yeah, it sounds like it. Yeah.
Well, it sounds like we got lots of different dogs and circumstances.
Yeah, for sure. It's interesting. Thank you for that. So that was a little side tidbit about the way guard dogs are working, though. It seems that they are, at least very temporarily and in a small area, displacing the wolves, whereas they're actually having to fend off coyotes in that same area. So kind of work different against the different species. Okay, so I just kind of want to wrap up. I threw a lot of information about just a few things at you rapidly, and like I said, luckily there's a lot of resources to follow up on that here. You can talk to me later. You'll hear more about this from Stuart, and I'm sure him or I or John will talk to you, because and Zach also is going to talk more about Flattery, so I didn't go into too much detail. But basically, there's some, the key points to reducing depredation is having the available tools and using them at the right time and at the right location. So being able to go into your shed and pull off the one that you need at that time and only use it for a specific amount of time really works. And one of the examples I think Stuart will probably talk about in more detail, but a lot of times we're using these things in combination. We're not just throwing guard dogs out there without a shepherd, maybe. Or maybe we're using Flattery to do some night pinning, and then during the day, the sheep or cattle are out with the guard dog's presence around them, or maybe both overnight. So, you can combine these tools in ways to make them a little bit more effective if you're in an area with really high depredation. And then the last point I want to really make is this human behavior element. And I think a key thing is working together to problem solve. And basically, I know the picture of Zach, who's talking later, but one of the things that's really worked is, a lot of times when, especially somewhere like here, where wolves are kind of new to the area, and so these are new issues, you might feel like you're alone out there, but you're not. And there are a lot of different groups that are out there to help, and a lot of times, though, they might not be groups that you're used to partnering with, right? So this is a picture of a wildlife service specialist, or, what we used to call trapper, shaking hands after a long day of the field in Montana with Zach from National Research Defense Council. And through a co-sharing, kind of collaborative agreement, they cost share Flattery to put up on ranches. And so, a lot of times just being able to realize our goal is all the same, whether, it's somebody that you might stereotype as a tree hugger or somebody that you might stereotype as a cowboy. The goal is the same, is to reduce risk, right? To minimize conflict. And, to me, that's so that we can all coexist. Now, coexistence can be at different scales for different people, as far as, what you might think is an acceptable number of wolves on the landscape or not. But the idea is to reduce conflict, because then that does allow the opportunity for both people to continue to thrive on the landscape and carnivores. And so I encourage people to really use opportunities like today to figure out who out there, and I think somebody's talking later about financial support in this state, but to really think about opening up the framework of who you're willing to work with, because we're all after the same thing. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions that are still out there.
Was there a particular breed of dog that worked best against wolves?
Right, so in our study, we were looking at different breeds from Europe. So a lot of times people say, oh, well, so the breeds that are really popular in the United States are Pyrenees, Maremma, and some sort of cross. A lot of them are just crosses. We call them white dogs, because somebody took their favorite Pyrenees and crossed it with something else. And they're great. I'm not trying to knock any breeds that are currently used, but they were brought in to work against coyotes. And so there's some of the smaller breeds. There's 33 breeds available around the globe. And so we brought in 3 breeds that are used more historically in areas with wolves and brown bears in Europe, and that are significantly larger in size, still not aggressive towards humans, so they're not used as sort of wrangling dogs. They're never used in dog fights or anything like that. They're really working lineage dogs, and tested them against what we call white dogs. And we're just now finishing up the survival analysis of sheep. And so I can't really actually tell you as far as effectiveness guarding that way. This was all with sheep ranchers. So I can't tell you those yet, because we're not quite done with that analysis. But we did do an analysis where we looked at differences in behavior and how they behaved towards. So we simulated wolf presence and looked at how they responded. And then we also used real data whenever wolves entered an area. And what we found is that they do behave differently, some of these breeds. Our initial survival analysis doesn't show differences among the breeds, though, but again, I can't say that definitively yet. But what basically, my kind of take-home message is, it's kind of like if I asked you if you drove a Ford or a Chevy truck. You're going to tell me one's greater than the other, but it's for very specific needs to you. And so what we've come up with is kind of like, here's how these different breeds behave. They all work against wolves pretty similarly, it looks like, and you can decide which breed fits what you need out of a dog. Or maybe you want a combination, so you have a couple of different types of behaviors. part of the difference is, for instance, like this one breed, Caracachan, it actually doesn't look very big. It's really one of these stocky, strong dogs. But what they tend to do is when they think a wolf is present, they almost act like a herding dog. They round up the sheep, and then a few of them go after the threat. And so some people love that because they felt like, it kept things together. Other people said, no, it's harassing my sheep too much, right? So it kind of depends on your needs. The Transmontanos were really good for people that move long distances. They just never fatigue. Some people didn't like them because they said, they're kind of lazy. So when they're during the day, they sleep a lot. I mean, they'll get up the minute there's a threat, but they actually worked really well and were the most attentive to the threat of the three species. So, and the way that they work is they're used to having to move long distances, so any chance they get to rest, they will, so that when there's a threat there, they can respond to it. So they just kind of, it's very subtle nuances, but we found that they were all really good against wolves, so, from our initial analysis. Yes.
Another little comment on that. Back in the late 70s, there was an organization somewhere back east that was experimenting with guard dogs. They traveled across the country and replacing dogs with, I was a sheep producer, no offense, I was kind of embarrassed to say that now, but anyway, I had about 350 sheep, and they brought me some of these dogs. I had 3 of them. I can't remember what they were, gorilla and 2 other crosses, but the guy was telling me that their theory, one of the universities back there was doing that study, that the shorter the nose, the better the dogs were for flock, farm or ranch flock situations. Because their theory was the longer the nose, the more predatory their behavior was going to be. You ever read anything about that or hear anything about that?
No, I have not read anything about that. I mean, I wonder if that's out of Ray Coppinger's lab. He did some of the original work out east, but
I think so. I think that
yeah. But I'd have to look that back up.
I just thought that was interesting.
Yeah, we haven't found that. I mean, the biggest thing I think people are concerned about is the roaming behavior. And, so maybe, I would think if anything, length of nose, maybe they can smell farther or something. But we just,
more predatory.
yeah,
behavior.
predatory.
But
Yeah, I
anyway,
didn't see
I
that.
just thought that was an interesting little highlight.
Yeah. No, we just, I would, we, in our study, we spayed and neutered everything, and it really did decrease roaming behavior versus some of our, because some of the dogs that were just the white dogs we used as controls weren't spayed or neutered at first, and we convinced the rancher that we'd pay for it, and they let us do it. And we really saw a difference in how much they stayed with the livestock versus roaming. And one of the biggest threats to your guard dogs is being hit by a car when they're out roaming or being shot by a neighbor. And so it really can increase survival of the dog too by doing that. So, yes.
I think I have 2 questions.
Yes.
One is just to follow up on the dog breeds. You talked about continuing your analysis with respect to sheep survival. How about dog survival? Because did you look at that? And at least what I've heard anyway is certainly the smaller the white dogs are just more likely to be killed by wolves, with respect specifically to wolves. Were the larger dogs less likely, or were you able to look at?
So that was part of what we originally were set out to look at, is survival of the dogs and attack rates by wolves. And, and we had this background data of the guard dogs killing or attacking, or being attacked by wolves. We actually we had 1 dog out of almost 100 that we put out on the landscape that got attacked by a predator, and we're not still sure if it was a wolf or not. We couldn't decipher, even with, we tried saliva analysis and everything, and it wasn't clear. It survived, and it actually worked again. One of the differences we see is certain breeds, if they, we had a couple animals that had been attacked in the past by wolves, of some of the white dogs, and when we simulated a wolf presence, everybody else gets up and starts barking and making a fuss however they respond, and these dogs would just be like, just lay down quiet. And that's not what you want in a guard dog. Whereas the breeds we brought in, the one that was attacked, it's still, unfortunately it's an N of 1, but from what we know from their country of origin, they still will perform the same way. They're too dumb, I don't know. No, they're just, it's more innate driven, I think. They're a little bit more ancient breeds.
Okay. Yeah, my other question, I just read about something, heard about it the other day, called the E-Shepherd. And have you heard of those? Are you guys looking into it? I think it's developed in South Africa, and it's a collar that you would put on livestock that's fairly cheap, and I think it has an accelerometer or something, and supposedly when the animal moves in a different way than it normally moves, i.e. it's running, then it emits a strobe light and a noise and that sort of thing. So that would be something that would only trigger when an animal's being chased. Have you heard of those or looked into those at all, or any plans to test them?
Yeah, so I read something, I think it came out as South Africa or Europe or something, where it was like related to heart rates. And again, the problem is cost effectiveness, right? So it sounds like a great tool, and I'm not saying not to use it, but it would be pretty costly, especially, a lot of sheep or cattle ranches are talking in the hundreds to thousands of head. So you have to select a few. We actually worked with the engineering department at Utah State to develop something similar, an accelerometer, but that's already in the ear tags that sheep and cattle already get. So that, instead of paying a quarter per tag or whatever, you pay 50 cents per tag, but it has this strobe light attached. So if they start running, it emits something. And it's just a matter of getting it down to where it's cost effective. We still haven't gotten there yet. To be able to do something that fancy. There is also part of that eShepherd system. I think some of it can also send a text message or something. But again, a lot of our ranchers in the United States are working in these remote areas where there's not coverage. So.
Yeah. Okay, I think they were like $100 each. So I mean,
Yeah.
not like a GPS collar, but still.
Yeah, but if
in
you're
a small operation and
Yeah.
around a yard or something,
or in an area with really high risk of depredation, then putting out 5 or 10 of them might be all you need, and then that might be enough. But yeah.
Thanks so much for coming all the way out and doing this presentation. It was really interesting to hear about the body of research. And I'm a little curious from a biology perspective about the body of science that has studied wolf behavior, as that was one of your categories, and how ecology is informing depredation science. Because it seems that even here in Southern Oregon with OR25 and OR33, they were lone wolves that had depredations around here. And that seems to be the greatest threat from lone wolves. And so I wonder, do you know about the body of science where we're looking at these kind of ecological principles of really established packs that have, they're smarter, they're more able to take out wild animals and don't have to resort to taking down prey? I don't know, maybe that's also a question for John as well.
Yeah. I guess I'm not clear. The question is are you asking whether lone individuals are more likely to take out livestock because
it seems like there's a lot of science.
They're not as efficient as a pack?
It seems like there's a lot of science that has shown that. And so I wonder how that's informing the intersection of your work or others doing similar work looking at protecting livestock and how that's informed by good kind of ecological practices and managing wild populations of wolves.
I haven't looked at that, to be perfectly honest. I know there's a more recent paper, is it Cooley et al., that kind of looks at pack structure and how changes in pack structure might affect their conflict rates later. And so I can talk to you later about that if you want to, because I just am less familiar, so that might be more a question for John or even Stuart, who's looked more at pack dynamics of wolves than I have. I'm not sure that it's completely accurate, though, that individual wolves are more likely to kill livestock than packs. It sounds like from some of the data coming out of U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, large packs, what he was showing earlier, large packs are actually more likely to kill livestock, if he's nodding at least. So I think I got that, interpreted that right. But let's talk later, because I can guide you towards some of the science that would know this better than I do, just off the top of my head.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, sorry I can't answer that better right now. But.
You buzzed over the scenting pretty quick. And the scenting, I've had pretty good luck with it. But you only deal with urine?
Well, in our study, we looked at coyote urine. So what happened, there was a study originally that came out of African wild dogs in Africa, and Botswana actually, and they were able to use scent mark to create boundaries for other African wild dogs not to enter. And so we kind of interpreted that and tried that with the captive coyotes, with urine, and it didn't work. They actually were more attracted to those areas. But a guy, I believe it was Dave Osband, is the lead author out of Idaho, was able to do some scent mark with urine around wolf packs that affected their use of areas. But yeah, we haven't done other, so sometimes, for instance, when I trap coyotes to put collars on them, sometimes I'll put out urine and scat from other areas, and it actually attracts them in, right? And that's how you get them to step in the trap.
Don't you scent to trap?
Well,
For most trappers trapping that I've done, we always centered them to the traps.
with urine and scat. But I don't know if wolf trappers use that, because I think for wolves it keeps them away, but for coyotes it seems to attract.
Or other scents. There's skunks are really attractive. Usually will bring something in.
Yeah.
But on the scenting for keeping stuff away, have you used man-made scents?
Not scientific tests, no. Yeah, it's all been, people just kind of ask, and I think it would just be something, again, just hypothesis based on the science we do know. It might work for short periods of time, but I think without that reinforcement of people behind the scents of people, they'd habituate pretty fast. Do you see what I mean?
I do, but if you change the scent
it might last longer.
and the frequency, if you took, for example, let's just use an orange Citrusol cleaner, and you were riding around your country, and you sprayed it someplace where the wolf couldn't come, actually make contact and smell it, but you got it up into the air currents. So he couldn't investigate that specific scent and be okay with it. But it was in the air. And then a few days later, you changed it again. And you just continually changed your parameter of your scent and in the area. Have you done any studies?
No, we have not done that. And if it's working for you, that's really interesting. And it might work. I think one of the things we've noticed from the wolf stuff, and I think John alluded to this with his slide on what's working best, is that wolves really need some sort of kind of muscle to reinforce whatever's supposed to be deterring them. So Flattery is okay, but turbo Flattery, so if they keep testing it and they get zapped, is going to work a lot longer. And so I think in this case it might be the same thing. Maybe the scent works, but then having rubber bullets for when you to remind them why that human scent is scary would work even better. You know what I mean?
I do.
Yeah. But that's interesting. I'll have to look and see if there has been anything done that I'm just not aware of. But
This started in Central California years ago with a lion problem on a ranch. And I started sending, and it stopped the lion problem. And I heard this from a lady who was quite elderly at the time, and she was like a mountain lady, and that's how I found out about it.
great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, well, I think I've gone way over time, so thanks.
About sheep mainly and not about cattle. And so I think within this area, we've got the Jackson County Stockmen's Association, and we also have California where wolves have come in. So what are we finding? I can see where if you have a rider out there, but we all can't afford to hire a rider to go out. And we don't have dogs that go with cattle. So, and we can make sure we don't have bone piles. But we're talking about cattle that are out in the mountains and hills around. And we aren't going to be there every day. So do you have any particular things that you recommend for cattle instead of sheep? Because that's kind of where quite a few of us in the area here are more cattlemen than we are sheep.
Yeah. Guard animals like dogs can work with cattle if you bond them with cattle. It can be a little bit more challenging when the cattle spread out, so they're not, a lot of areas where they are worked with them, the cattle are kept more combined. So yeah, cattle is by far our biggest issue because of the way that we in America graze cattle. In other countries, a lot of times they do keep them and move them. They move them like sheep across the landscape in Europe. So they move as a small herd. So it's really easy for a guard dog and a herdsman to work with them. Range riders are really effective. There's a program in Montana, the Blackfoot Challenge. Zach, are you talking about that at all? Okay, so I will just leave it there. The Blackfoot, because you know more about it than I do. But they actually work with cattle. Flattery works really well if you are in pastures that size. And this is where human behavior can come in. I mean, sometimes, again, there might just be some risk that you have to decide you're willing to accept or change practices in some way. So introducing different breeds of cattle, this is where maybe some of the husbandry things, breeds, timing of calving, so that they're not calving maybe when they have pups to feed, things like that might come in handy. And that's kind of outside my realm of what I'm looking at. We're looking at ways of applying a lot of the non-lethal tools to areas with cows, but we're still working on that because you're right, I'm sure there's sheep people in the room that would disagree with me, but sheep are relatively easier to protect than cows. And so we're trying to figure out, well, what works, and then how can we apply it to cattle? And range rider programs are probably the most effective thing out there right now that's already available. Or, the flattery, almost all the flattery we work is on calving operations, so.
Well, your range riders, are they with one herd or what? Because cattle go to the mountains and they don't stay in groups like sheep do.
Yeah, no, I agree. So we have it a couple of ways. I worked with the Green River Cattlemen's Association, which is based in Wyoming, and it's interesting because when I go out with those ranchers, they actually were driving around, they're like, yeah, there's a wolf pack here, there's a wolf pack here, and they're like, I don't care about them anymore. They said, but you didn't think you'd hear a cattleman say that? But it's because they have grizzly bears now to contend with, so that's their new threat. But they're trying, for instance, so they've done like collective things where all of the people that graze in a certain area get together and kind of cost share. And, they even mix herds during the open summer season, and then they separate their cows at the drive at the end of the fall. But they can cost share that way the price of hiring a range rider, and they work with their local, state, and nonprofit agencies that also help cost share that. So there's ways to kind of bring down costs that way if you can work collectively within your community. And then the other way that they do it is they've started trying to do what's called like low stress herding, where they're slowly trying to teach the cows to hang out closer together even when there's not human, slowly over time. It takes a couple of years, I guess, but the cows now want to hang out together more. And so it's a lot easier to protect them both by the range rider or to introduce guard dogs or other techniques by having cattle that actually want to herd.
Okay, well, I've actually seen films that were done, I don't know if it's Montana or Wyoming, where the cows are really afraid of the wolves and they won't go places and they're picked on in groups. And so I'm not seeing an answer to those particular things right now, because once the cows get the idea that there's wolves around, they won't go. And the problem is if they don't go, then you're losing your feed and your production and all this kind of stuff. So I can see with your sheep working in a group and doing that, but in these areas that the wolves have overwhelmed more because there's more wolves in the area, that they have a real change in the attitude of cows, and they have a real problem with that. So that's where I'm kind of wondering how somebody can work more on that. It's not bones there, and it's not, range riders or whatever, because they're watching these cows and they're watching the wolves. So it will be a real challenge with the cattle situation when you're on thousands of acres in the range. Well, so anything you have to offer on that?
Yeah. You know what I wish, what I would like to see is states get together and do like exchanges. So have a bunch of people from Ennis, Montana that have now lived with wolves for 30 years come out here and say, this is what's working for us. Because I think there's actually a lot of things that they used to say just like that 20 years ago that aren't issues anymore because they've learned how to restructure their ways in a way to still be profitable and reduce risk at the same time. And so I can't answer that question right now, but the good news is there are answers out there in communities that have already been dealing with wolves and at high numbers for, more than a generation now. And so now it's their children having to deal with it, So I think more community exchange within, maybe this is something for your Cattlemen's Association to see if there's a Cattlemen's Association just outside of Rocky Mountain, or not Rocky Mountain, Yellowstone National Park that could change information.
Well, they have come to the conferences and stuff. In the last couple of years, I haven't heard any great answers. And so I know what you're talking about, and I know some of the people that have made the films and have done the studies for 10 or 15 years, and they haven't found an answer as yet. But I'm looking forward to some.
Thank you.